I'm going to first thank you all for having us here present today, and we've been looking forward to it. And I'd like to start by introducing Peter Callahan, the Executive Director, who many of you have probably met already, and just have him kick off our presentation discussion on the Internet of Water.
All right, thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Tim, and everybody for having us on as a presentation in the staff meeting. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be part of the Nicholas Institute. We feel very at home with you guys. We think it's a really fantastic shop that we live in. We get fantastic support from Duke overall and from the Nicholas Institute in particular. And I know I and my team have enjoyed every one of our interactions with our colleagues at Nicholas Institute, and that's a rare treat in the world. And I think we all are lucky to work at the Nicholas Institute. So thank you very much. The Internet of Water project is a really fascinating idea. For those of you some of you have been exposed to it before, but I'll just quickly summarize it and then let Ashley and Kyle take over to describe it in more detail. But what you see here on the screen is our broad vision. We envision a world engaged in sustainable water resources management and stewardship enabled by open, shared, and integrated water data. Now, this is a very broad idea, and the connection between data and water stewardship, better water outcomes, really is about policy and science. And in fact, one of the reasons that we're very happy to be at the Nicholas Institute is that environmental policy questions are handled at the Nick Institute in a way that go beyond academic questions and actually try to impact action in the world. And that's what we see as our real added value. We want to connect water data to decision making. In California, we're seeing massive biodiversity loss while also seeing farmers and their families struggling, even high crime in the Central Valley during drought events. Why is that? The reason that's true is because we have great difficulty, California has great difficulty managing its water resource. They actually do it really well, surprisingly speaking, surprisingly because of the difficulty of water management in California, but there are still these huge challenges that have to be faced. And how we get from where we are today, which is a vast engineered system in California, for example, to which is somewhat sustainable, but probably not all that sustainable over time, is through better information and greater precision in water management. The same is true in New Mexico, the same is true in Texas. Now, those problems are more or less severe in different places around the country. In the East, our challenge is water quality. Flint, Michigan. It would be the people of Flint would have been much better served if there were a greater availability of water information, greater early warning about contamination or the arrival of, or the experience of lead exposure, the potential for lead exposure. If that could have been made more revealed to the community, that crisis might have been more quickly averted. So the key is to link data and information to policy outcomes. Now, why isn't this done? This is the central issue of the Internet of Water. It's because there are three sectors of society that might have solved this problem for us by now. So, for example, we have weather information widely available on our phones. You can pick up your phone. Everyone right now can find out, what the temperature is outside your room. That's pretty amazing. It's awesome. And there's no reason why you should not be able to pick up your phone and find out the quality of the river in your city. But you can't do that right now. And there are three primary reasons why that's true. The public sector has failed to address this problem because water governance in the United States is fragmented. The private sector has failed to address this problem because there is no demand signal for the data itself. And the philanthropic sector has failed to address this problem to date because the scale of the problem is really large. So what has happened is Duke and the Aspen Institute back 2 years ago or so got together and worked out this concept of an Internet of Water, and really, to Martin Doyle and Lauren Patterson's credit, they said, look, we really have to get serious, and we actually have to get some serious money behind this problem. So they assembled the Internet of Water project and the really awesome sort of grants that we have, which is they're significant. And so that investment that philanthropy has made has given us a fighting chance to get started with an Internet of Water in the philanthropic sector, with partnering with academia. And the goal is to actually ultimately create a multi-sector coalition that supports this project over time, with federal resources, corporate resources, technology resources. That is our ultimate hope. But we have to map this out. We have to show people how it works because it's a bit esoteric. So I'll stop there and say that we have a big vision in front of us, and we think we've come up with some really great paths forward around that vision. And I'm going to let Ashley and Kyle tell you about that. So thanks.
Thanks, Peter. So just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to do a little bit more conversation about the rationale of the Internet of Water. It's designed to mobilize both cultural and behavioral change, as well as technological change. We're going to talk about some of our open data resources, our technical framework, and how we actually accomplish those things through engagement and outreach. The fundamental premise around the Internet of Water is that our water data infrastructure is broken. Engineers have given water infrastructure grades. They gave dams a D, levees got a D, inland waterways got a D, and drinking water got a D, and wastewater got a D+. And so an understanding that there can be a large sort of variability in what that means across states and local governments, but overall across the country, not super great grades. And we think that water data infrastructure probably also is a D. And this is because of two main reasons. One is that we're struggling with legacy infrastructure. In many places, water data is still recorded or held in notebooks, not in digital format. When they have had technology, it's technology from the late 90s, so that technology is also obsolete in helping them engage and connect with other technologies. We also have a serious issue, as Peter indicated, with data fragmentation, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But fundamentally, the concept is water data infrastructure is broken. And a quick little demonstration of how effective something different, of envisioning something different could be. Earlier this year, the IOW team visited the Mebane wastewater utility managed by Dennis Hodge. And Mebane, for those of you who don't know, is just about a half an hour away from Duke, not quite that far actually. A fairly small utility that serves about 15,000 people. Now, Mebane is part of the Jordan Lake, which has a lot of water quality challenges and regulations that have been, coming down the pipeline for years. That would eventually require Mebane to treat their water differently. Dennis understood and could see sort of the writing on the wall of what was coming. And at the time, the utility was collecting their data on 19 clipboards, manually sort of writing down, going out, taking their measurements, writing them down on their clipboard, walking back into the utility office, entering it on a spreadsheet. If there's something not recorded correctly or something that seemed off, trudging back outside with their notebook. And so, Dennis recognized that this was likely a problem, and he personally used the software Quicken for financial reasons. And this was his aha moment, right? Why can't we manage the data in my utility the same way I manage my financial data? And so he has a younger colleague that works with him. Her name is Amy, and she's a lot more familiar with online platforms and tools. So in 2015, Dennis and Amy purchased iPads and set up a set of Google Sheets that have calculations set up ahead of time. So technicians now take the measurements, they enter it into the iPad, the calculations show up immediately, and if there's an error, they can correct that immediately. It also decreases the chance of human error from writing it down to entering it in. And they've invested in some other utility management software that would build the capacity of both to have Wi-Fi sensors and some other things that sends data automatically to the system. Now, because Mebane, this Mebane wastewater utility invested in this data infrastructure, they managed their system more efficiently and saved the city $2.5 million on a new infrastructure for the treatment plan. And so you can also imagine, though, how much time they've saved in employee labor cost in this practice also. So this is just one utility and an internal data infrastructure. And so you can imagine the impact if this were spread out across many utilities, many different organizations that collect and manage water data. The benefit would be quite significant, profound, changing, life-changing, right, for many. And so that's really the bottom line, right? And to manage water resources sustainably, the management has to be integrated, and that integrated management needs that integrated data. We like to think of data as pieces of a puzzle, and the watershed is the full puzzle. And so you can imagine a lot of different people have different pieces of this puzzle. And so the trick is, how do you get these pieces together, right, so that you can see a full picture? To create the full picture, the pieces, we must be able to find where the pieces are. We must be able to access those pieces. People must be willing to give up their puzzle piece, right, or to include it in the overall picture. And that puzzle piece must be usable. It should match and fit into the puzzle. But it's not everyone's primary mission to do that. And that's why we need the Internet of Water, to build the infrastructure that makes these data more findable, accessible, and usable, so that we can finally see and manage, understand the full picture. To do that, there are three broad categories of work that we're engaging in. We're developing technical resources, which Kyle is going to talk about in a moment. And this includes designing the overall infrastructure for the Internet of Water. There's also a large social engagement component to what we're doing, creating a unified vision for water data. You know, how do we show the value of water data and its ability to answer real-world problems and inform better decision-making? And then there's a capacity and equity component. So let's say that somebody says, yes, I would actually love to, invest in a data infrastructure here in my utility, but I don't have the funds to do so. And so is there a way that we can match, this is ultimately in some ways a policy question too, some of the federal grants to data needs and so on and so forth. I'm actually going to skip this and come back to this at the end. I have some questions connecting with the work of everyone else at NIEPS, but in order to move through and save time. So I'm going to go straight to talking about our resources. And so there are two primary resources we're going to show you today. One is our water data inventory, and the other is our Coming to Terms, our water terminology collection, which Kyle is going to talk about in a moment. For the inventory, one of our first tasks was to sort of assess the water data landscape in public agencies in the U.S. We wanted to know who is collecting water data, what data are they collecting, and how discoverable, accessible, and usable those data are. So Lauren Patterson developed an inventory process and has been working to implement it. So far, we actually now have Utah, but this graph is a little bit old, although Utah just came on last week. So we're actively working toward adding other states. But as you can see here at the bottom, 326 agencies involved with water and 279 platforms to find water data. This is a highly fractured water data infrastructure, and that's what the inventory showed us, is how fractured that water data infrastructure is. We also use the inventory to create a score, basically, and that's what you see here in this graph with openness metrics. How discoverable is the data, how accessible is the data, how usable is the data, and then there's an overall score. And if you look to the vertical axis here, you can see the federal government actually does fairly well in most of these categories, in large part because they're required to. But if you look at the other states, and we were talking about that grade of a D earlier in the presentation, you can see, well, there's an awful lot of poor grades here. And so one of the benefits of having this kind of tool is that it has allowed our state partners to be able to go to their higher level decision makers, for example, or even their own colleagues, and say, this is an issue that we need to address, and the way that we have to address it is by developing different data management infrastructure here within our agency. And so far, our partners have really appreciated and received a lot of benefit from having this inventory. This inventory is designed to be a complete outsider's view of their water data, and so it has also prompted a lot of our partners to do an internal inventory as well, building off of the process that was developed. And so now I'm going to switch over, and let Kyle pick up. I'm stopping my screen share, Kyle. I'm going to let you go.
Does anyone have any questions on what Ashley said so far? All right, how can I do this slideshow?
Hey, Kyle, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So obviously it's a lot of Western states right now. Is the idea to kind of stay west of the Mississippi at this point and then come east, or is it just as states come on, just as you can get agreements going with states?
Yeah, I would say it's basically as we can get agreements going with states. There was an early bias towards the Western states because that's where the interest was near the beginning of the project, and that's where a lot of water supply challenges are more acute, and so there's more interest in this. I would say, Peter and Ashley, do you want to add anything to that answer? Okay. So I'm Kyle Onda. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the data architect, or basically the technical lead of this project. And, sort of an upstream problem when we're talking about trying to put these pieces together is what each piece means. And the providers of these different pieces generally use different vocabularies. So well upstream of any data integration problem, there's a shared language problem. And so a motivating example is the Colorado River. This is the lifeblood of the Southwest. 40 million people, 7 states, 21 tribes, essentially rely on this water for drinking and for all commercial and agricultural uses. And so predictably we're getting to the point where water use and water demand is projected to be running up against the actual water supply in this river, which is currently allocated based on an interstate treaty that was signed in 1922. Okay. And so an example vocabulary problem with this is the term consumptive use, where a lot of times you need to quantify how much water is available after it's been used upstream of some point. And so a key term there is how much of the water upstream was consumptively used. And basically, there are many definitions of this term that are used for regulatory purposes in different jurisdictions, which becomes a huge problem when we're talking about interjurisdictional deal making with something like the Colorado River Compact, which will be renegotiated in the coming years. So for example, consumptive use in New Mexico for legal purposes is defined essentially as evapotranspiration, the volume of water that is evaporating or being used by plants and crops. In Colorado and Arizona, consumptive use sort of incorporates that volume as well as water that's being incorporated into products in like manufacturing or livestock, things like that. And then in Washington, the definition includes all of that as well as transfers to other basins. Whereas the previous states don't count a transfer to another basin as a consumptive use. So you can see that if you were to apply the same methodology of one state to calculate consumptive use in a different state, you would get different answers. So to try and tackle that kind of problem, one of the first things I did was create what was first called the Glossary, but now we came up with the catchy name Coming to Terms, because we have to come to terms with our language around water, which sort of collates together the official water vocabularies used by public agencies across the country. And we aim to get everyone, but so far we're sort of at the states chosen. And I've set up a process where there's a combination of kind of a central process of Internet of Water staff, as well as sort of partner organizations like the Western States Water Council. Some of their staff are helping collect this information, as well as I've set up a sort of crowdsourced process. And I'll just show you what that looks like real quick here. So you can see we have 24 vocabularies in there right now. And actually Oklahoma was the first, the Oklahoma Water Resources Board were the first people who contributed a vocabulary on their own without sort of one of us going and collecting it. So, you know, it's sort of just a searchable dictionary, but to go with consumptive use, you can search for consumptive use. Here's New Mexico's definition. And if you click on it, you'll get sort of all the related terms. And you can see that the New Mexico definition of consumptive use corresponds to the Wyoming, Utah, California, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation term evapotranspiration. Whereas this group of terms with this definition group number correspond to these various agencies' definitions of consumptive use. And then all of these definitions of consumptive use are kind of unique in their own special way. And folks can also, you know, download their terms as an Excel file, things like that. And so there's also a system that allows the crowdsourcing of the identification of synonymous terms, where you can select a term and then go in and try and select terms that you think are synonymous. And then there's a submission system that currently I ultimately moderate and decide if they're right. So that's that product that we've got going. Let me switch back to the PowerPoint. All right. So does everyone see how we can put it all together?
Yes.
Okay. So that's the vocabulary issue that we're beginning to tackle. But now I'm really getting into the nuts and bolts of what the Internet of Water is about, and how kind of we're connected to other things NIEPS does. So if we think about policy questions, example of like how much water should be reallocated from a reservoir, or should be released from a reservoir in some time period in the near future. You know, ultimately, we're relying both on legal questions and scientific questions to address these policy questions. And those scientific questions might be something like how much water is available in that reservoir. And that, in turn, that question relies on sort of more basic scientific questions like what's the average precipitation? What is the average stream flow flowing into this reservoir? And so these are sort of the green mid-level questions. And really what the Internet of Water is about is the data questions that you have to answer the scientific questions, right? So to answer the question, what is the average stream flow flowing into a reservoir? You need to know what stream gauges are there out there. And then how can all those stream gauges data be accessed? How certain are the resulting data from each stream gauge? What units are those stream gauges reporting data in, and what transformations do I therefore need to apply to compare them or aggregate them? And as all of you are probably painfully aware, it's actually these kinds of data questions that, you know, people getting PhDs and people with PhDs probably spend like 70 to 90% of their effort on when trying to answer a scientific question. I think the rule of thumb in the data science and industry is 80 to 90% of work is essentially data wrangling and answering those kinds of questions. So we essentially want to make those questions much easier or even automatic to answer, which will allow policy and scientific questions to be more easily addressed at much lower cost by a much wider group of stakeholders. I don't
we can
know,
skip this to the end. I have it at the end. I
okay.
have it at the end. Yeah, thanks.
All right.
Sorry.
So how are we planning on making those data questions easier to answer? And so in a technical sense, we're doing three things. We're looking at standards for data and metadata and APIs. We're looking at hubs, which are kind of structured sources of standardized water data, and web infrastructure, which enables web crawlers and search indices like Google to begin creating automatic connections between sources of water data if they are published in certain specified ways. And these things all correspond to making data more discoverable, accessible, and interoperable. So when we're talking about making data more discoverable, the key things are metadata, so making sure that data is well documented. We know for what purpose it was collected, the real world feature that data is about, where it exists on the world's surface, and where it exists online, with web infrastructure, so which is more about where the data is located online. To make data more accessible, we would like to get to a place where most data is served via API and can be queried in automated ways. And that way, people can create web applications of any configuration that they choose to access and stream data in the manner that most works for their workflow. And then hubs are sort of online collections of data where data can be directly searched and queried and downloaded in bulk. And those types of things need standards and specifications around them for both how they work and for where they can be hosted online in a cost-effective and secure manner. And finally, in terms of making data more interoperable, this is all about data standards and metadata standards. We would like data to always be documented with enough metadata so that if it's tabular, we know what each column means exactly. And that way it's much easier to integrate data and reuse data that was collected for some purpose and use it for a secondary purpose. So an example of like where we are and where we want to go is this little story. So going back to that policy question, I might ask the scientific question, how much surface water is flowing through some point on the Colorado River system? And to answer that type of question, the current workflow for many people is, all right, I know the USGS collects a bunch of this data. I'll go there. 8 clicks later, I can find the time series for a stream gauge. And then if I'm a subject matter expert, I might know, the Bureau of Reclamation probably also has their own stream gauges. I better take a look there. And that's another 4 clicks to get a stream gauge data time series. And then I'll think again, like, you know what, in this area, I bet Colorado Department of Water Resources probably also has stream gauges. I better look there, get familiar with that system. 5 clicks later, I get some other stream gauge. And so where we would like to get is where basically you could Google this query, streamflow Colorado River near a reservoir, and this happens on Google Maps or some kind of similar product. And you would get every relevant stream gauge from every organization in a standard format and be able to visualize and download it at once. And so the plan to do that, putting the sort of the 3 pieces together that I talked about, at the bottom, we want to sort of evangelize around data standards and metadata standards that have been developed by kind of the geosciences and water science community already, and are more adopted in Europe than the United States, but we can try to evangelize that stuff here, so that more data is produced or at least translatable into these standards. We've published documentation about ways to set up data hubs to collect, store, and serve standardized water data. And we've been collaborating with the US Geological Survey around the web infrastructure, around ways of tagging data so that it can be indexed and linked to each other. So that, for instance, you could go to a web page on the USGS about a hydrologic unit, about a watershed, and that website will have links to every single stream gauge and water quality monitoring station within that watershed, operated by every organization that has served water data through one of these hubs, whether USGS or not. So that's a nice little architectural diagram, but putting that all together is easier said than done. And so I will hand it back off to Ashley.
So now we're going to talk a bit about the engagement side of the house, which is really what focuses on the behavioral and cultural change for the Internet of Water. Does everybody see the slide engagement on your screen? We're good? Okay, great. In order to do the work that Kyle talked about and that I talked about earlier, the people and the agencies in which they work actually have to behave differently. Their organizations have to operate differently. And in some cases, states are doing this on their own, like what we're finding in California. But in others, we can play a role here, a different kind of role. And so while we are focused on changing minds and behavior, which is a very difficult thing to do anyway, we want this change to happen to be long-term and sustainable. And so the method by which we go about engaging with our stakeholders, it is important that we do so in a way that fosters a sense of ownership. And so to achieve that, our approach to engagement is a participatory approach, which means we center our relationships with our partners on partner needs and given whatever context in which they live and work. Basically, they drive the bus, we help navigate. And so pilot projects are in response to partner needs, but we also have another objective, and that is to develop these projects in a way that is transferable and scalable, both to other states and state agencies, some even municipalities, but then also regionally and at the basin level as well, and on up. So we want a national network in which entities talk to each other. And so currently we have projects going on in California, Texas, North Carolina, the Upper Colorado, and New Mexico. And you can also see on this map that we have early hubs at Wade and Kawazi. And we have many other states that are expressing interest in working with us. We decided to focus on state agencies for our pilot process because states hold and manage a lot of water data. Changing the behavior and the structure in which states maintain and manage their data is actually critical to establishing the national network that is our ultimate goal. But we have to keep in mind that each state has very different needs and they're moving at different paces, and they do so within a certain context that is unique to their state with different sets of pushes and pulls. And there isn't a single bureaucratic approach that can be deployed to meet that level of diversity. Instead, we have to meet our partners where they are and enable them where they are. And this is a really core component to our engagement strategy. For example, in California, we're working with stakeholders to enable the work of the Open and Transparent Data Act, Water Data Act from 2016. Because of that act, California's data infrastructure is already largely in place. So our role in the context of California is as a trusted outside partner who can act as an intermediary between state agencies. And in this context, we're enabling projects around water demand, drinking water quality, and harmful algal blooms. In Texas, there's a completely different context. We have the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Our partner in Texas loves to say this phrase: in California, they legislate; in Texas, we percolate. That's her favorite saying. And this is a key difference between those two contexts, right? So there's no legislation that is guiding the agencies in Texas. Instead, the main water agencies in Texas have voluntarily come together and identified 3 key areas that need attention. They've identified flood, drought, and surface to groundwater interaction. However, none of that work happens very well without sort of a centralized data hub. So in Texas, our work centers on supporting the construction of this basic water data infrastructure in Texas. Yet in another completely different context, we have North Carolina. North Carolina is hyper-focused on flood and drought resilience for water utilities specifically. And as such, in North Carolina, our work is focusing on enabling local governments to meet regulatory requirements. And there are emerging equity components to our work in North Carolina as we focus, at least in part, on building the capacity of medium to small utilities to meet these demands. And then again, New Mexico. New Mexico is a wonderful story of success for us. That's been a great opportunity for the Internet of Water. In April of 2019, the Internet of Water worked with Melanie Stansberry, who is a state representative in New Mexico, to write the New Mexico Water Data Act. The act was passed into law, and in May, the Internet of Water began meeting with local stakeholders. The law outlined specific tasks to be completed, and for example, identified 5 directing agencies. They identified a lead agency. This was a very important part of that policy, who the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources, and our primary partner there, Stacy Timmons. They allocated a small amount of money to support the process, and they gave it a strict 6-month timeline. So this was a whirlwind of activity that ensued over the following 6 months and was honestly nothing short of extraordinary. The 6-month timeline had been put in place, honestly, to ensure the failure of the New Mexico Water Data Initiative, but they did not fail. And in fact, they succeeded quite well and are continuing to grow and develop their water data hub to be something more sophisticated. So our role in New Mexico has been to enable this to happen in this time frame in which it was mandated to fail. And in doing so, we guided New Mexico agencies in building this water data infrastructure that they can, in fact, continue to build upon. For us, we have taken away from our engagements with our partners some really key lessons learned. And the first is about engagement itself. When you do it well, you get more done in a shorter period of time. Effective engagement is key to this process. We also have to understand and respect that there are capacity limitations. Cultural norms and technical capacity must be addressed, or really there's no place to go from there. If you people must have a belief in the effectiveness and need for water data infrastructure, and then they also must have the technical know-how, the equipment, the capacity to actually get it done. And finally, with regard to our resources and tools that we showed you a couple of already, stakeholders are a very important part of that development process. We want stakeholders to use the products and the resources, the tools that we develop. And so they actually hold the key to helping us develop user-friendly and effective resources and tools. And so we must listen to them. I think all of you are probably aware that there are thousands of health apps out there on the market, and we probably use 15 of them regularly. And that is a great example of how technology can be used to develop an enormous suite of products that are not used by the people they were intended to use them. And this has a lot to do with a lack of engagement, either heavy development from the software side with no engagement from the stakeholders, or heavy stakeholder engagement with little ability to invest in the software application development side of it. Those things must come together. To give a quick example of how this worked out in New Mexico, now that New Mexico has built their water data hub, they can ask questions of their data that they could not ask before. Stacy Timmons, who I referred to a moment ago, had frequently hypothesized that fewer groundwater level managements had been taking place in recent years. with the New Mexico Water Data Hub, it was fairly easy to pull data from the USGS and the state agencies that collect this data to answer her question. And so what we show here is that the number of measurements, in fact, has been declining, and you can see it's geographically situated, those in the orange, the last measurement taken before 1980. So, you know, this is something that gave Stacy important information for her to be able to take this and examine why this is happening. And as more agencies add their groundwater level data to the hub and standardize it, this picture may in fact change over time. The other thing that this allows is for the creation of sort of simple data visualization tools. One of the master students here at the Nicholas Institute was doing an independent study with Lauren Patterson and developed a dashboard that you see here that shows well locations. And you can click on the well and you can see a time series and all of the well's attributes, for example. So once this underlying data infrastructure has been attended to, you don't need necessarily highly skilled data analysts to start building the types of tools that are actually very useful for decision makers. Stacy in New Mexico was absolutely thrilled with this and said this is something that she had been begging for years. And because the Water Data Hub existed, it was something that took place that could be developed in a matter of weeks. So really showing how having this data integrated and placed in a accessible way, that it really opens the door for all kinds of innovation around decision making. So I wanted to kind of think about how what our work does connects with some of the work at the Nicholas Institute. And so I kind of put together these three big categories of things, of connections, right? One is, you know, sort of some of our policy challenges. So for example, in North Carolina, if you're a small water utility and you want to build out your water data infrastructure, the monies that are available to you to do that, to build up infrastructure, do not apply to data infrastructure. And as we demonstrated earlier, there are lots of benefits to be able to do this. And in fact, when we talk about resilience, for example, and the plans that the EPA and others ask of these water utilities, are asking them to make data-driven decisions about data that in fact they don't have. It's impossible for some of these utilities to look over the long term over time to see how some of this stuff has changed. At the same time, it's impossible for them to get the money that they need to be able to make those upgrades, because it's not part of our policy, right, to include data infrastructure. The other is just thinking about, I'm sure there are other sectors in which there are legacy agency behaviors and infrastructures that pose a challenge to progress. And I'm sure there are other programs here at the Nicholas Institute in which entrenched agency behaviors or ways of thinking or infrastructure have been a particular challenge. And I think it would be great to hear from others and about how they maybe breach these, you know, very tall walls in some cases. And then finally, the issue of equity, which has been something that really comes up in a lot of our work. And this, as I have pointed to already, states and utilities vary widely in their capacity and their resources. And so what are some of practical steps that others, perhaps in the Institute, have taken when working with partners to alleviate or address those equity issues? And so I think that's all of our presentation for today. I want to open it up in the last few minutes. We made it just with 2 minutes under, Tim, for the 10 o'clock.
Let's go a little bit more. If people need to drop, they can drop, but let's make sure we have enough time. This is a rich presentation, and let's make sure we have time for people to give questions, have questions, and give feedback and stuff. So.
Yeah,
thanks,
that's great. So anybody has any questions, feel free, and I'll leave the slides up and I can navigate to a slide if someone needs.
Hi, this is Kate. That was super interesting, and I guess my first question is, when can you do this for air monitors and energy and all sorts of other things? But I was wondering if in the water context, you saw any of the same trends with these three challenges you have here, and that first one saying that infrastructure dollars have not been put towards data infrastructure. In the last administration, EPA was really trying to modernize some of its enforcement and working with state agencies, and specifically on their sort of electronic capacity or electronic data gathering capacity, so that, you know, EPA databases and state databases could sort of talk to one another. And it had mixed success, and some states just are so far behind on these things. But there did seem to be some push there through EPA grant making. And I was just wondering if you've seen that in any of the natural resources agencies, or even in the water part of EPA. I just happen to know more the air side. So wondering if you saw any of those, at least promising beginnings of trends in the water space.
Peter, you can go.
Yes. So yes, we have seen some positive trends. The E-Enterprise Council of EPA, you're right, Kate, that's a really good start. And they do in fact have an exchange network program that allows for grant making. Also in the Bureau of Reclamation, the Water Smart grants go in that direction. EQIP grants at USDA do that. So there are avenues. The challenge is we have to, in a way, it's this kind of very slow moving process where the state has to apply. They have to know that that's available. They have to apply. We sort of help them apply, and then the scale of the funds available are good for the state, but they're really not. It's sort of, I don't want to say it's too little, too late, but it's sort of these are all mostly small dollar exercises. And sort of slow moving. So there's this kind of general and a lack of coordination, essentially, that I see. There are programs, but what's needed in my mind is a bit more coordination across the board in this direction, and more sort of agency cooperation around it, so that and awareness raising, so that the states know that they can actually use this money for these purposes. Kyle, what were you going to point out?
I was just going to talk about how, right, there's ongoing modernization pushes in going through like ECOS with E-Enterprise and stuff.
But yes, hugely important. I mean, I just really quickly, when you said Oklahoma had been willing to share data, I was working with them on oil and gas data a few years ago. It might even have been in connection with a project I was doing with Lauren. And we had to disable Java from our computers in order to pull the data from Oklahoma's computers, because they were from pre-internet. It was unbelievable. So
you got it.
I'm feeling your pain and glad you're doing this.
Thanks, Kate. I see that a message that I have. I just saw the chat, and I see that Liz has her hand raised. I'm sorry, I don't see all of your faces on my screen. Liz, did you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Ashley. Thanks. I agree with Kate. This is really terrific. And I see a lot of parallels with some of the work we're trying to start up on on sustainable infrastructure, and looking at developing a hub, which I'd like to talk with you all individually, but I have two specific questions. One, actually following up on what Kate asked at the beginning, is what is the time frame on this? On where are you trying to get, and by when? And then the second is, I noticed on your website you have a coming soon link for community science, and I'm wondering if you could just say a word or two about what you're expecting to put in there.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I can take the second half of the question, Peter, or you want to take the first part of the question?
Sure.
Do you want to go first, or you want me to?
Yeah. So the larger time frame question is, we're in the startup phase of the Internet of Water, which is a 4-year period from 2018 to 2021, essentially. And then we'll enter a second phase where we hope to have a larger expansion to more states, more communities, and achieve in that second phase a steady state where we can actually maintain a broad network nationally. Doing that will require, significant coordination with the federal government and with a number of state agencies, and we're working really hard on that. And also philanthropy. Philanthropy has to keep helping us in this regard. So it's a big challenge. We're working on it. We're feeling pretty good about it. But we're in phase 1 and startup phase, and phase 2 will be run from 22 to 26 approximately, and then we'll see where we are. We're kind of and then internationally, you know, that's a really good idea. It's a kind of a bigger idea, more complex in the sense that most the developing world really, like if you, in some ways, the states of the United States are like developing countries when it comes to this. But that said, we also have broadband infrastructure, we have a modern economy, we have all kinds of things that many developing countries don't have. So we can maybe envision a leapfrog effort in the developing world for something like this, where we leap over older technologies and just implement new ones, a little bit like cell phones in Africa. But the global idea is a really big one and would require a lot more sort of thought. But on the, going to your question about community science, I'll give that over to Ashley.
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. There's actually a couple of answers to that question. So we are engaging with community science in a variety of ways. The primary way, well, one of them is through the Water Data Collaborative, which is a collection of NGOs and community science groups. And we're establishing a hub with the Water Data Collaborative, helping them, and Kyle may be able to say more about this if you want more details on what they're doing specifically with their hub, but helping them ingest data into a common data hub, and also addressing some of the concerns that others have around community science data about metadata, data standards, and data quality. So that's one side of it, and we're actually on that page that you pointed to. Eventually, we will actually have a toolkit alignment with the tools that the Water Data Collaborative is building with the IOW. On the other side, more applied, we're in California, for example, the HAB harmful algal bloom project there. We are working with the state of California to help them build a HAB early monitoring system that actually incorporates data from NGO, community science groups, and tribal agencies. And so we're in the process of, actually walking the walk with it in California, so to speak. And then we also have sort of this broader national network that we're connecting with. Community science data can be a wonderful resource, as I'm sure a lot of you know, whether it's condition monitoring or other types of water quality work. And we want to facilitate the integration of that data with as much ease as possible, so that decision makers have sort of a full vision and suite of information available to them. So it's happening both at the partner level, like in California, but we're also trying to establish something more national. Kyle, did you want to add anything about the WDC data hub?
So the two things I'm working on them directly with are we're developing kind of a data model and a API that would enable, and a lot of documentation around that API that would enable NGOs to publish their water quality data directly to WQX, which is the EPA's replacement for STORET, the main EPA water quality database. It's technically possible to do this. Anyone is allowed to do it. It's just, it's a technical headache for a lot of lower resource NGOs. So we're helping build a tool that will make that much more push button. The other thing we're working on is a sort of a documentation kit for data quality, and not just sort of numerical data quality and missingness and stuff like that, but good metadata documentation around what procedures were used to sample and analyze water quality samples that allow then governments and regulatory agencies to use NGO data for the purposes for which it is fit, rather than the status quo, which is usually blanket distrust NGO data.
Right. Thanks.
I see, Steve, you have your hand raised.
Yes, just a quick anecdote. When Earth Justice was fighting over the water quality in the Shenandoah River, they ended up submitting photographs of the green slime on the river to the Virginia water quality people, and to pick up on Kyle's point, were roundly rebuffed, saying, well, that's not really, we can't QA, QC that, so leave us alone. ended up in litigation. Just saying.
Yeah, that's a great point, Steve. And one of the things that one of the things that we intend to try to help, or what's happening within the community science NGO community, is we're trying to professionalize and make more sophisticated their capacity to collect and manage water data. We don't actually help them with collection, but we help them. The Water Data Collaborative is an effort funded by Pisces, one of our donors, to modernize and strengthen the quality, QA/QC, of the NGO data. And then our role is to actually integrate that data with state data. And that's actually the harder trick. But once you do that, then you have what we hope is a common truth that we can say, look, this is the common truth that both the community is engaged in, that the state has arrived at, and then we can actually say this is the condition of the water. And actually, this is one of the central problems from a policymaking perspective that probably all of you have in each of your universes, which is, what is the truth? Now, obviously, people have different, we could have a philosophical discussion about that, but if we believe in empirical evidence, which we do it at Duke, right? Then it's useful to sort of, and if you do successful stakeholder engagement, that's critical. There has to be the buy-in of the community into what data you've collected, how you've put it together. And yes, this is indeed the jumping off point for the discussion about the policies, this set of data, this set of information or conditions. And I think that's really the critical piece. I also think that the act of doing that can bring stakeholders together in ways that they are unable to, it can be a conflict resolving technique, because most people are sort of, their walls are up with if the contest is very strong, and most of you know this in any environmental contest or debate, everybody's backs are up. But if you can get them together to talk about the data, not about the outcome, but just the data, then you actually have them in the same room talking about a problem. And that collective problem solving activity actually gets them to collective problem solving about the policy, and it supports that. And I actually think, frankly, that's what gets me out of bed, is the idea that we could actually improve collective decision making. That's really why I think the Internet of Water is powerful.
Thank you. Have you folks, didn't Alexandra Cousteau try to start some sort of citizen-generated water initiative at some point a couple of years ago? Yes,
Circle of Blue is her initiative. It's a great initiative. It's a good initiative. It's designed at a sort of higher. I don't want to. Among trends, I would say it's a bit superficial. It's focused mostly on the policy questions and kind of the community engagement part, but it didn't really drill down into the actual challenge of bringing these data sets together and the technical pieces. I don't mean superficial in a negative sense. It's focused on the engagement piece and awareness piece, and that's critical. But it's more of a kind of a high-profile, celebrity-driven kind of thing versus our work, which is, we always say we're the non-sexy back end. That's what it's not very visible what we're doing. And we don't have many shiny objects, but what we're doing is trying to do something that's way more fundamental, like the pipes.
Yeah, good for you. Thank you.
I think.
Let me
Robert,
jump in for a second. Yeah, I was going to observe Robert has his hand up, so let's do Robert. Let me observe actually that Alexandra and Ginger Solar Board came to us with the Circle of Blue stuff in the past before we had an IOW. We clearly didn't pursue working with them that much on it, but again, just observe that. And third, after Robert, let's bring this to a close and invite continuing conversation. I do actually want to circle back to a couple of the topics from the beginning. I've actually gotten some input from folks while the call's going on that I can share that would generally be more enabling for student hiring and things like that. But Robert?
Yeah, this is really, really impressive. Great presentation, and got me thinking, just like Kate, I'm thinking about, okay, how do we do this for carbon? But my question is, about your interaction with maybe some of the federal land management agencies, the BLMs, the Forest Service, whether there's interest there. I would think there'd be a lot of interest. So much of the water in the West comes off of Forest Service ground. Also interested in engagement with NRCS, their snowpack data. Are there opportunities there that you all see?
Robert, the answer is yes. All of that is land management, land cover data. Like one of my good colleagues used to say, you can't understand water if you don't understand land cover. And it's really true, like, because the impact of how land use is really the primary sort of reason, it's just the primary driver of the condition of the water and also the sort of consumptive use and all of those things. So it's an unexplored territory for us, Robert, because we have focused initially in our federal discussion with the EPA and USGS, because they're the sort of holders of the nation's water data. But it's truly the next step. And I do think, and as you say, there are many holdings of data, water data itself in USDA, in those land management agencies, and also critically important water adjacent data, what we call water adjacent, which is land cover and all those things that are essential to doing analysis about water. So I would love to talk to them. And perhaps what I'll do is reach out to you offline, because I'd like to make some inroads to those folks in an appropriate way.
Yeah, happy to help in any way. They would have, I think, a tremendous amount of interest in what you all are doing.
Great. I'll follow up with you about that.
Fabulous. I know I said that was the last question, but anybody have any crushing questions? I also invite people to look at the chat, and sort of there's good conversation going on there. But guys, this is really impressive. Data visualization tools, I think, are one of the most powerful things we have to work with policymakers, and this is a lot of fun. So thank you for the presentation and for the work. And any other last, streaming, I want to say something, comments before we move on?
Hey, Tim.
Great.
Sorry. Yeah, just this real quick. I think I agree this is impressive, and I almost want to share some of this recording, this presentation with colleagues, faculty, and maybe even collaborators outside of Duke. So I just wanted to ask everybody at some point to follow up if we see if that's okay, if people are comfortable with sharing the presentation and follow up with me, because I do think it would be good for some of our colleagues to see.
That works. That's fine with me.
Tim, I'll just add one last point. Yeah, it's fine with me too. Some of you have said, and I've talked with Jim about this, you could imagine an internet of carbon, an internet of internet of fish, there's a lot of things you could imagine in the environmental data space. And there are many, many differences, of course, in the way data are managed in those other fields. Water is extremely heterogeneous, for example. Energy data, for example, much more organized. It's pretty much handled by the Energy Information Administration, for example. But I'd be more than happy to talk to any of you. My background is actually in a broader suite of environmental data management. So I'd be more than happy to talk to any of you about the problem of environmental data and how it supports policy. And if you'd like to, I did a whole project on carbon data before. I was working with these guys I gotta remember it now, but with NASA on Global Carbon Observatory and an integrated global carbon observing system. So anybody that wants to talk about environmental data, I'm happy to talk to you about it.
That's great. Take him up. Take Peter up on that.